It's my complete pleasure to introduce Cristóbal Elgueta. Is from Chile and is a forester and a wonderful garden designer. And he did a program in September that was really well received. And we are looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight. So Cristóbal.
Thank you so much, Helen. I'm so happy and so proud to be invited one more time. And what can I tell you? And just thank you so much for allowing me to show you what we've done in Chile. And yes, we do have a lot of, we're quite similar to California. So I think that a lot of the gardens that I showed today will be very useful for all of you. Today, I will talk about paisajismo ecosistémico. The translation would be like ecosystemic landscaping, if I can say that, which means that is to understand and to design a garden thinking how nature works. In a few words, but we're going to talk about that. And I don't work alone. I work with my partner, Macarena Calvo. I'm a forestry engineer, and she is an artist and landscaper designer. And we've been working together for more than 10 years. So a lot of what I've done, she's been my partner doing it. So she's been very important in my life. So what we do with Macarena when we build a garden, and it's pretty much the same for every landscaping designer. So I have to build my garden, or I was commissioned to design for someone else. And what do we usually think? What we do when we start designing? And normally when you talk about design, you want nice plants, nice design. You want to have a garden as beautiful as you can. And usually beauty is one of the most important things. And of course, use plants that are well adapted. Normally, and that's every one of you knows that you have to take consideration of the place, of all the things in the place that you're going to work that you cannot change. For example, the climate and the soil. And this is very important because when I started working as a landscaper, I usually change the site to meet the plant's needs. And then I very fast understood that you have to select the correct plant for the right plant for the right place. It's very important to take account of climate and soil. And we are a very diverse country. So pretty much like the United States, this picture is from Chiloé in the south of Chile, which is a temperate coastal climate with very acid soil. But this picture is my house where I have like clay, alkaline soil, very hard water. So you cannot use the same plant everywhere. You have to change the plant palette depending on where you're working. And that's mean the native plants and also the exotic plants. Usually, and I think in California, it's pretty much the same than in Chile, that we're very lucky with the environment. So usually I have to work in places where the environment is very interesting. So usually I want the environment inside of my garden. So I use what I call the diffuse limit. So I want my garden to be like infinite, not to, to finish in the mountains or in the ocean, but I don't want what I call a closed garden. So environment is quite important. And usually we do take, it's very important for us to highlight architecture. So we do have very interesting buildings with architecture. So we want to highlight the architecture with our gardens. And when you have more space, or when you work in public space, it's very important for us to walk and discover the garden. And this is a garden in Patagonia, like in Coyhaique, which is near Torres del Paine in the south of Chile. So different conditions, but still you want to discover the garden. You want to invite your customer to discover what you've done. And one of the things that is so important for us is the plant palette, but especially the dynamic of foliage, textures, and flowers. So you'll see that a lot of the gardens that I will show you today, they do have a lot of flowers. Because I was born in the central area of Chile, which is very dynamic, our semi-arid and Mediterranean system is very dynamic. So you have almost everything change every 3 to 6 weeks. So if you come to Chile, for example, in early spring or by the end of the summer, or I think it's pretty much the same in California, you'll see a completely different landscape depending on the season of the year, and everything changes very fast, and this is very inspiring for us. So we want to build gardens that are very dynamic, not just in the color, but also in textures, flowers, foliage, and scent. This is quite important to us. So you will see in all the gardens that we have to build different plant palettes and different color palettes also. We do take a lot of care about that. And because what we've learned with Macarena is that color can absolutely change people's mood. But because we work in a more ecological way, it's not just the people, but also the insect. So what we've seen, for example, is that a lot of our native insects are very sensitive to certain colors, but not to others. So we're gonna take a lot of care about which is gonna be the color palette that we're gonna use in every garden. And also, the color palette of the environment is very important for us. So you'll see that most of our semi-arid, for example, or Mediterranean gardens do have, for example, a lot of orange, blue, purple. But if you go south, you have a completely different environment and a completely different foliage color. So you see a lot more of pink, purple also. So you see how the colors change depending on where I build the garden, okay? But the big question after working maybe 10 years is why to design just a garden? Because usually that was I did when I started, just building gardens, designing gardens. But I think that we can do a lot more bigger and more challenging than just build a garden. And why starting doing this? Because normally when you start working as landscapers and you start to have more work, usually you have to work in places where before the house there was a very rich and diverse nature and system. And I don't know how it works in the States, but here in Chile, usually when you build a house, we destroy almost everything. So you realize that we have a lot of hotspots, especially in the coastal, semi-arid, and Mediterranean area. But making a garden is just thinking about design, color, season, beauty, environment, or to use plants that are well adapted to the condition of the place. It's just that. And the answer for us is no. But usually we started to understand the dramatic change that happened after many of the houses that we work on were built. So especially in our system and in central Chile, there's a lot of very specific relationship between plants and insect. And a lot of our insect and our plants are endemic because we do have geographical big barriers like ocean, desert, cold in the south. So when you start to realize that when you wipe out a lot of the native plants that we used to use, we accelerate a lot the process of extinction and degradation. So for every Puya chilensis that you cut, it means that thousands of or hundreds of the chagual butterfly, which is absolutely specific from the chagual, will disappear. So I think that we landscapers and gardeners, we have big responsibility. And we know that there's a lot of plants, there's a lot of insects that are endangered, and every insect or organism that disappear, finally, it's a lot more than just a moral dilemma for humanity, but we have loss of genetic, food, biotechnological, medical potential. So to lose species is a big problem. So the question is really human development or economic growth or what else opposed to respect to nature and care for environment? And the question is what we landscapers could do to make, in a certain way, a better world. And that's when we started working, and I started thinking what I call after paisajismo ecosistémico, which is a way to make gardens thinking in how ecosystems work. It's a more biological and sensitive way to think the garden. And this is very interesting because it's not just beauty, it's not just adapted plants. It's not just design, but there's a plant community is design, is a careful selection of plant material that where understanding that when you choose a plant, it's not just the attribute, like if the plant is adapted or if the bloom is nice, but you start to understand that you have to work with plants as a plant community. And that's very important because you start to think as a whole and not just in the plant, that every plant that you choose to add to your plant community affects all the other plants. There's a lot of interaction, but not just interaction between the plants, but at the same time, there's a lot of interactions that happen with all the diversity that potentially can live in your garden. So it sounds very obvious, but here relies what I call the core of what I later call paisajismo ecosistémico, which is ecosystemic landscaping. So what is paisajismo ecosistémico? Is a garden methodology or landscaping methodology in which the design is inspired by the dynamics and succession that naturally happen in ecosystems. So I want to transform my garden into a powerful and effective conservation tool. So I'm not just planting plants because I like them, but I'm planting plants because I want to provide as much biomass as I can, nectar, pollen, grains, fruit, because I want to attract as many wildlife as I can. But I'm going to choose beautiful plants because we humans, we have to fall in love with our garden. We do care a lot about nesting and habitat. We do work, our wildlife in a lot of places is very endangered. So what we are starting to understand that we really can change the conservation of species, for example, just changing some things, choosing some plants and creating habitat so that we can have our birds nesting in the gardens, or maybe you can have some lizard, or we don't have dangerous animals. So it's not a problem for us to have snakes, for example, because they're not dangerous for us. The other thing is then when you start to understand the relationship between plants and insects, you start to understand that you can have the biological wildlife living in your garden. So I've not used any pesticide for the last 25 years because I made a plant selection which is very attractive for beneficial wildlife, especially flower flies, which are very interesting to control pests. I also understood that most of the time I do have to work with very bad soils, what I call the bad soil, which is finally not the bad soil. And I think that using plants communities and especially understanding plant cycles means that you can have multi-cycle community with root exudates. And that's very interesting because you can use just stone and sand and you can rebuild soils just using plants and very fast. And then I learned that you can restore soils using plant communities and microbiology and restoring the soil food web, which is quite interesting. But at the same time, when we changed the way we do landscape, we understood that you have to try to make landscape as cheap as you can. So these super gardens, very expensive, finally are not very ecological because you cannot, how can I say that? I need to make gardens that people can copy and can easily do. I don't want to make super gardens that just for very rich or wealthy people. I want to build gardens for everyone. But not just because they're cheap to build, but at the same time, I want gardens that really needs very low maintenance because it's a big problem for us. And at the same time, obviously, water-wise gardens because we have a big drought. But the most important is that if you are ecological, water-wise, etc., but you don't make gardens that are attractive to people, finally, the garden is going to die. So you need to make people to experience nature, but you need to make people love their garden. And that means that to make a beautiful garden is very important for us. So we're going to make a small tour. We're going to see very strange gardens. So we're going to see a supermarket, a winery, private gardens, public space, green infrastructure, green infrastructure. So we're going to see a lot of different things. But I want to start with this garden, which is very important for me because it's a supermarket. So normally when you have to build a garden for a supermarket, I mean, the owner of the supermarket just wants grass or something cheap and easy to maintain. And this supermarket is in a very special place in the coastal desert in La Serena. I mean, some of you came to this area when you came to Chile. This is a very arid region. In a normal year, you got 70 millimeters of rain, which is nothing. So you have to use a minimum of water. But what is interesting is that the place where take place the desert blooming. So what we're going to do, we're going to transform places that no one's want to do anything in the supermarket, which is a parking area. And what we're going to do, we're going to build a small, what we will call a small blooming desert, if I can say that. And we're going to use some of very endangered plants. We want to attract as much wildlife as we can. But what is very interesting is that we want the customer involved with the garden. So we're going to try to make some marketing and try to get some certification because we want in a certain way to we want our customer, our clients, to position his brand, that he is respectful for the environment. Okay. Normally, when we start a project, for us, it's very important the natural plant communities that usually grow in this area. So normally there's nothing here, but when you got some rain, you have the desert blooming. And although the project seems very simple, there's a very complex plant community because we need to have a garden that is, how can I say, like blooming the whole year. You cannot have just a nice garden during 3 months and a awful garden 9 months a year because they're going to change the plants. And when you work with semi-arid plants, you have to try to understand how they work, and especially watering, especially drainage, which is very important. So we made a lot of trips to try to understand how plant communities inhabit each place in this system. And that was the first garden where we understand how important cycle and plant architecture is to make a plant community. So it was very important for us to see the color palette, the plant palette, but also how the arrangement of plants in nature, because the plants arrangement in nature is not, I mean, it's random, but at the same time, it's not random. So the plants have a special architecture that allow them to grow with other plants. And that's what we try to understand in all these trips. We have a lot of different plant communities depending on the soils that we have in the north of Chile. So you can have sand, you can have granite. So you have a completely different color palette and plant palette depending on the soil, especially how far or how near from the oceans are. And which is interesting is that when you start to see plants with a more scientific way, you understand that there's a lot of key concepts that you have to work with, which is the cycle of the plant. That means when they grow, like cool season, warm season, which is very known in grasses, for example. And then understand that nature is a lot of cycles, one after the other. So especially in semi-arid areas, you have a very long blooming season because you have a lot of adaptations and you have this nature in this infinity of cycles, one after the other, which generates a very rich and dynamic, what I'm going to call multi-layer system. And this multi-layer system is not just the way the plants use the space, but also how they express the growth in time, which is very interesting because architecture is very dynamic in our plants. And normally when we work in different places in Chile, we always choose with Macarena what we're going to call an inspiring muse, which is normally a flower that has a plant color combination that is especially beautiful for us. And there's very common in our flora that you have some of the plants that they inside of their flowers, they have almost all the of the colors of the whole plant palette. So it's very good for us because we made this combination and normally it works very well. Okay, so this is a supermarket, like every supermarket in the world, not especially attractive, budget absolutely minimum. The garden was not interesting. I mean, the owner was not very interested in the garden. There's no soil preparation because normally we see the soil we have, so we choose the plants that will grow in this soil. We normally use drip irrigation system, but what we call a plant-to-plant irrigation system. That means that every plant has a number of drips of can I call drip? I mean, gotero, I don't know how to translate that, but the plants have different requirements of water because they come from different areas. So every plant is gonna have the water it needs. So we make difference between plant to plant. And we normally plant very small plants when we work with native plants because we know that they will grow and adapt better, especially because in our semi-arid plants, you have huge root system and very small aerial system. So there's a balance that usually you don't have when you buy big plants. What was interesting is that we just water the garden every 2 weeks, and 1.5 years, the garden was like that. Almost no maintenance, and the amount of insects and was incredible. The owner was absolutely happy because the water bill was a joke for him. He thought he was going to spend a lot more water. And which was very interesting is that a lot of the customers of the supermarket came to us, which were the name of the plants that we were using. And we used just native plants. We didn't use any exotic plants in this garden, just native from the coastal and central system of the semi-arid Atacama Desert. The plant combinations, we have most of the plants are cool season growing plants, but we have some warm season also. That means that we have blooming almost a whole year. And because of the plants selection, we have a lot of biodiversity, birds, a lot of insects, butterflies, and in a certain way, when the desert blooms, the garden seems a part of the desert and doesn't look like a patch, which was very important for us to have the local I forgot the word in English, but well, you understand. I mean, it looks very local and not imported from everywhere else. A lot of insects that I've never seen before. And because we usually follow the growing of the gardens for many years, we realized with Macarena, there's a lot of different insects. And usually we talk about very generalistic native insect that usually goes to a lot of different flowers, which is more easy when you want to preserve them. But we also have very specific or specialists that goes to just one plant, 2 or maximum 3 plants. So depending on the area where we're working, we usually try to get as much information as we can through reading papers or specialists. We work with a native bees association. So they tell us which are the bees that we have in this area and normally which are the plants that the bees visit. So we see if we have more generalist or specialist bees, because we want to preserve as much as we can. So that was a supermarket, and this garden has a lot more glamour than the supermarket. It's a winery in the central area of Chile also. And that was interesting because that was when we built this garden like 12 years ago. And we were working with this paisajismo ecosistémico. And we wanted so much to apply all the things that we learned in agriculture, because usually the fruit production in Chile doesn't take care very much about insects. Usually you have a lot of fruit, but you don't have any biological corridor. So what we do is to build in a certain way a corridor. It was interesting because the vineyard didn't want a biological corridor. They just wanted a garden because they were building all the wine tourism project. They built the winery and they wanted tourists, so they wanted a garden. And we didn't build, I mean, we built a garden, but not just a garden. So we wanted to build something more useful than just putting nice plants. So we build this biological corridor, and the concept of food continuous supplies was very important, especially when you want to sustain permanent and numerous population of flower flies. So if you want to have biological pest control, you have to feed the insects. So we wanted to work with it. Flower flies are not very popular. a lot of people do not know that they do exist, but they're absolutely amazing because when they're young, they love meat. So they eat a lot of plagues, aphids, but hundreds, thousands every day. But we do have a problem because adults are vegans, no meat, just pollen and nectar. And because they're flies, they go to very specific flowers. And because a lot of our flower flies are native, they just go to very specific native plants. And you need the plants, but also you have to synchronize when the plants are blooming. You have to choose the correct plant to synchronize when the adult is flying and when the plant is blooming. This is not a flower fly, but I love this picture. This is a microavispa, is a micro wasp, very interesting also in pest control, and also needs, when it's an adult, some pollen and nectar to have energy. And I'm not going to tell you what the insects are doing because you're adults and you know what is that. But you can see that pollen and nectar is quite important for these insects to breed. So we wanted to do a lot more than garden. But at the same time, just building the corridor was not enough. So we wanted the vineyard to understand that this garden was going to be very useful for the to position it, if I can say that, the brand of the wine. To say that the wine was very ecological, friendly, etc. This garden was necessary. But these are expensive wines. And the problem is that usually you don't have huge areas to build gardens. Usually they're very small because they want to produce as much grape as they can because it's worth it. So we worked in what we call espacio residual, which are the spaces where they don't grow nothing. Usually they just apply a lot of herbicide. Usually is where they put a lot of trash and whatever. So we work in this area, but we also work with all the water system. As California, during the summer, we don't get any drop of water, no rain for sometimes it can be 7 months. So we do have a very good watering system, what we call acequias. And we work all the acequias because we wanted to generate habitats for all the amphibians that we could, small mammals, etc. And because a lot of our amphibians are very endangered. So we wanted to create habitat for them also. And we wanted to use this in the brand of the wine. And because a lot of the water came from agriculture, and that means that the water came without the phosphorus, all the remaining water that we do not use was treated in what we call a technical wetland to try to take out from the water as much phosphorus as we can. So we have a lot of plants and stones, and we make the water like it slowly goes into the river again. So we try to catch as much nutrients as we can. So we don't want to pollute our rivers. We don't pollute the rivers, but the agricultures that surrounds us, yes. That's also part of the wine of the watering system. So it was just water, and we plant a lot of different exotic and native plants. And we do have a lot of ducks and animals now nesting in this area. And we also put a lot of plants because we wanted to make the water quality better. And this is the area which was like where all the trash of the winery was. This is very important for us because we wanted to increase as much as we can the biodiversity. So what we used here was native and exotic plants. Cold season plants, a lot of them natives, and some warm season plants, which are very attractive for even our native bees for the summer, because we want to have the garden blooming the whole year. That is what happened finally. You can see that all the watering system was restored, a lot of diversity, different kind of plants, blooming, pollen, nectar, etc. We have a system of trails which were based with grape shoots. They look very nice. We have this plant community, and I like very much this picture because this is a kind of mingling between exotic plants like the Salvia indigo spire, which is very interesting for wildlife, especially for hummingbirds, and this Eryngium paniculatum, which is one of our most important native plants if you want to attract wildlife, especially insects, flower flies, native bees. And it shows how using exotic and non-invasive exotic plants and native plants, you can generate what we call the continuity in the food supply, which is very important, not just for human, but also for nature. These are some of the stones that we use to create habitats for reptiles that usually hibernate under the stones, especially for our native snakes, which are not dangerous for us. And this is a picture after 10 years. So the garden was the 10th year of the garden, which was very good. And what we did is we didn't work just some areas, but we make a big corridor to connect the different areas of the winery, because we wanted all the wildlife to move because this winery was built between two rivers. So what we wanted was to connect the two rivers with this biological corridor. And finally, the garden became one of the most main tourist attractions. So what makes this winery different is the garden, not just the wine. There's a lot of tourists going to the winery just to visit this garden, and that makes us with Macarena feel very proud. And we use some exotic salvias to provide hummingbirds with food during the winter, because our native plants that provide them with nectar is an hemiparasite plants, very unpopular, so usually it's cut. So we use these native salvias to try to have to increase the hummingbird population, which finally happened. And normally what we learn is that when you work with ecological and when food supply is very important, we do this sheet with different kind of plants that we, how can I say that? We use 4, 5, or 6 different categories of plants. We always use some endangered plants that are endangered of extinction because we want to make conservation. Some of the times we don't have these plants on the nursery, so we get seeds, we send them to a nurseries, and they multiply them for us, which is very important. We use some plants just because they have a very nice color dynamic, but we've not seen anything just visiting them. But we separate the useful plants into generalists and specialists, because we want to preserve as many specialist insects as we can, because normally they're the most endangered, because they're so specialist that if you take out the plants, they will disappear. And what we learned from this garden is that when you build a garden, you have to think that you have to make obviously something very beautiful, but you have to deal with all the forces that balance nature. And that means that you have to start to understand that when you do landscaping in a certain way, you have to be a biologist, entomologist, hydrologist. So you have to know a little bit of everything and work in team with other professionals that can give you as much information as you can get to make this garden a lot more than just a nice plant arrangement. Now we're going to see a completely different project, and this is called what we call green infrastructure. What means that because we're facing a huge drought, we have to start changing the way we've been gardening, taking out the lawns, the grass, and using more water-wise plants, but not just because we want to save water, but at the same time we want to increase the biodiversity of our city's garden. And also it's taking a lot of importance for us to work with microbiology, because a lot of the water that you have in the city has a lot of pollutants, and we don't want to send the water into our rivers, but we want to treat this water in our gardens. So this is what we did in La Municipalidad de Providencia, doing what we call the bandejones inundables, which are gardens that are made for water infiltration, water harvesting, to reduce water runoff to the river. We want to decrease the use of water by minimum an 80%. We want to reduce maintenance, which is a big problem for us and almost to every one of us. And because most of our trees, our native trees, are cool season growing trees, we want to harvest as much rainwater as we can because we want to reduce as much as we can the irrigation during the summer. And we want them to live just with the water which was stored in the soil after the rain. And it works. This is the first project that we made, which was a small area. Usually politicians don't want to take risk. So we just used a very small area. My boss, which is a very smart politician, was not very happy at the beginning because, as you can see, the gardens didn't look very nice because we changed the way we work using a lot of stone. We use what we call technical substrate, which is made from stone and sand, and just a little bit of compost to inoculate the microbiology. She's my boss. You can see that, I mean, you cannot see her face, but you understand that she's not that happy because this new way of planting was very strange. Normally, when you try to change people's mind, it's a little bit hard here in Chile because we're used to see grass and everything green. And when you start to see this with a lot of stone, it's very hard for us to understand. Moreover, we were using very small plants. Usually when politicians plant, they use big plants because they want to show everything nice from the first day, but with Mediterranean and semi-arid plants, this is not a good idea. And that was the first one. 6 months after, the plants were growing absolutely fast. A lot of the plants are cool season growing plants. So after the first rain came, this was a very, very dry year, but you can see that the gardens are growing like very fast. The stone was covered. So my boss started to talk to me again. And that was a very rich and diverse community made with this multi-cycle and multi-layered system, because we want to have root exudate the whole year. We want to have as much flowering period as we can on pollen and nectar. And this is very important because also we want the neighbors to be happy with their garden, so we need the color. And we use a drip irrigation system and we use it weekly. So finally the water saving was about 90% comparing to lawn, which is a lot for us. You can have what happened just a year after we finished. So everything is blooming. I would say a little bit crazy. The second year was very different, but a lot of flowers, colors, everything was covered. And the maintenance was almost nothing because this gravel system helped us a lot with weeding. So almost no weeds, so no work. And that was very good because it was in this is a picture of 2020. And a lot of us were in quarantine. We couldn't work. So the garden was absolutely, no one was taking any care of it. And the garden looked great with almost no work. Which was interesting is that diversity is incredible. When you just change the plant palette, what happened with the insects and diversity. So in this very small patch, there were like 30, 40 butterflies, a lot of flower flies, native bees just flying. And it's incredible because I have no idea where they live or where they nest, but they came to the garden once the food was served. So it was quite interesting, and no plagues because of the flower flies. This is a more urban garden. This is, I would say, like a business quarter where a lot of business office. We have this is like a roof. We have a very small depth of soil. And what we did was a very dynamic and colorful garden. Biology was very important for us in this also because we wanted as many. It was in the time where the honeybees started to have more attention. So that was one of the target. But we wanted, this is a very green area with very non-dynamic gardens. So what we wanted with Macarena was to build a very dynamic and colorful garden that grows, that changes very fast. We have some restaurants and coffee, and this is very unusual for us. Usually you have like the terrace and you have some lawn, but you never have like flowering plants or perennial. And it's very nice with a lot of color, very dramatic, changes every 3 to 6 weeks, and very low maintenance, and also is not very, very water wise, but less than 50% of what is required to keep the grass green in our area. Lot of bees, lot of birds, lot of the grass, they have like edible seeds. So we do have a lot of birds eating the seeds, a lot of hummingbirds during the winter, etc. And it became a very popular garden. Like the coffees, they've been very successful, and the owners always said that is because of this combination between the terrace and the garden. It's a very nice place to be, very colorful and nice. This is a garden that some of us, you came when you came to Chile. This is a palm garden. The story of this garden is nice because it's a agriculture man that produced milk. And when he was a kid, he used to play in a French park where there was a lot of palms. And his friend was went this. So he was going to sell the property, and my customer bought all the Chilean palms, which are endangered. But not just the Chilean plants, there was also the Phoenix and the Butia plants. And we made what we call the Aconcagua garden, which is in the Aconcagua Valley, which is a arid, semi-arid region. So we started transplanting the palms during the spring. This was an area which was used to produce food for the cows. So that's why you see everything green. And we were just transplanting the palms in September, which is the beginning of the spring in my country. We let them quiet. We did nothing during this summer because we were still designing the park and doing some work. We just watered them during the whole summer, and the transplant was absolutely successful. None of the palms die. These are Jubia chilensis, which are like almost 300 years old. So for us, that we're a very young country, 300 is a lot of time. So they're very important for us. And what we did finally was to build a garden in the middle of what we call an alluvial valley. So what we have here is sand and stone. Long time ago, there was a river here. Now we have a lot of stone and sand, but also a very good soil for agriculture. And what we did was a lot of trails, a series of paths, because we wanted to have this kind of immersion in nature. We have densely planted areas, and we wanted our customer to experience this experience of a lot of plants. Because the neighbor, he has another garden which was built by Juan Grimm, which was very green the whole year. And we wanted to make a completely different garden with a lot of color, with a lot of flowers, and with a lot of Mediterranean and native and exotic adapted drought adapted plants. We also built a pond here. And what we used was what we call a biofilter system, because we wanted crystal clear water. It's not just a pond, it has a filter which is made with stone and plants, because we wanted to have very good water quality, because we were going to bring some endangered native fish and some native amphibians that are almost extinct. And we wanted to create an habitat, and we've been very successful. So we have a lot more than we have at the beginning. We use a lot of native plants like this Stipa caudata and also the Eryngium, but we also use a lot of Mediterranean plants from California, Europe, Australia, South Africa. We feel very free to use other plants. We just ask to use non-invasive plants. So we have a lot of Cyanotus, some Esperaloes also. This is what we call the plant community. As you can see, a lot of plants growing in the same place. And it is very important for us, the compatibility of the cycle and the architecture. So what you're going to have is a garden that changes very fast, like every 3 to 6 weeks, everything changes very fast. And the plant selection was thought to bring as much pollinizer as we could bring to the garden, because we're working in a very important agriculture area where most of our very good fruit is produced. So the owner wanted to have a lot of native and honeybees visiting the garden, and because he wanted these bees also visiting the fruit production. So this is a garden we use a lot of altomedias, which is my favorite flower. These are non-native, they're hybrids. We do have also some natives, but these hybrids blooms the whole summer, and now we have a lot of new selections which are very nice. This is the middle of the spring. This is the end of the spring. It's a semi-garden, so you can see how the plants palette and the color changes very fast. And we have a lot of different areas. The trees are growing. All the trees are native. We use just central Chile trees like quillaja and cryptocarias, which usually used to grow in this area. Now it's too dry, they don't grow, but usually they used to grow with the ponds. And this is where the pond is. Here you have the biofilter. You can see where the plants are, and here you have the stone. So here is the area where you have the water and another filter, and you cannot see here, but it's a completely crystal clear, and we succeed in what was with the fish and amphibian bringing them, and we have a bigger population, which is very good. There's a acequia system. Acequia is a way that we bring the water from the Andes and we use it in the Central Valley. And it was very important for us in a certain way to use also this acequia, because we love the sound of the water, and we think that in Mediterranean the use of water is absolutely very important. This is beginning of the summer, a completely different color. You'll see a lot of different plants, and normally in a crystal clear day, you will have all the hills of the Aconcagua Valley, which are very high, and at the end of the valley, you have the Aconcagua, which is the tallest mountain in America. This is the end of the summer, the same area. So you can see that now you have purple, less blue. So everything changes very fast. The trees are growing. And what we want to have is probably in 10 or 15 years, we want to have this garden a little bit looking like the La Campana National Park, with all the quillay, the juveas, and the native shrubs. And this is a crystal clear afternoon, and you can see all the hills of the Aconcagua Valley. These big trees are not inside of the park; they're outside of the park. But we use also the diffuse limit to try to make this park with no bond, a never-ending park. Okay. And finally, we're going to see a completely different garden. I know that this is a Mediterranean society, but probably in the north of California, you have some of the temperate area, I think at the very end. And we do have a temperate zone in the south of Chile. And this is different because I think it's more important here, the woodland system, and which is very important for us is the natural swimming pool. Our temperate system is interesting because you have like the two growing seasons. You have a lot of cold season growing plants and also warm season. So you can build very dynamic and very diverse communities also. But we do have a huge problem with weeding. So we have to try to establish plants in a way that we reduce as much as we can the weeding problem. And when you work with this system and you work with these two systems at the same time, we have to be very clear about how you're going to make the pruning, for example, the pruning time, because this system is not very cold in the winter. Usually you have a very cool season growing system starts growing very early. almost in fall. So it's very important if you work with some of our native bulbs or exotic or native cool season plants, you have to be very, you have to know where to prune so not to damage the plants that are finally starting to grow. And which is interesting is that system has a very dynamic color palette. So in spring, early spring, end of the winter, you have a lot of very like pale colors like white, light pink or light blue, etc. And then you're gonna have the purple, the dark pink, very much like the flowers of the Fuchsia magellanica. So probably you know the Fuchsia magellanica because I saw that one of you likes fuchsias. So we're gonna use again these native plants to be inspired for the plant palette and this color dynamic to try to have not a patch, but a certain continuity with the surrounding. And what we're gonna build in this garden is a natural swimming pool, which is a swimming pool, but all the purification of the water is done with biology. So we don't have any chlorine or ozone or nothing, just stone and plants and a pump system. And we're gonna use, because in this area of Chile, the water is very soft and acid, we're going to use which is called the carbon limitation system to try to keep the water crystal clear, absolutely free of algae. Okay, so this is a garden. There you can see the natural swimming pool. What you see here is the biofilter. The water is absolutely crystal clear. This is early spring, so you can see that blues and white are the colors of the flower dynamic, and the garden is surrounded by the Nothofagus wild forest. So we use a lot of plants similar in color and shape to the Nothofagus to try to make like a very soft, not to make a big difference between the garden and the surrounds. This is a natural swimming pool. This is Olivetia chilensis. Probably you know these plants. It's very, I've seen it a lot in the States. And also Joellana punctata, which is a very interesting plant, very easy to grow. And this is an Alca gunera, but a small gunera, a ground cover, which is Gunera magellanica. And I don't know if you can see, but you have absolutely crystal clear water. And this is the swimming area. And this swimming area goes inside of the forest. So it looks very nice, a nice place to swim. Here you have again the Libertas, the Joellanas, the view of the house, the surrounding. You have the Villarrica volcano here in this area, and you have all the Joellanas, and we're going to have again a multi-cycle, a multi-layer garden. So when time is advancing and you start with the summer, you're going to see that all the color palette changes. Here is a biofilter. It was done with Phragmites australis, mostly with some iris and some juncus, which are very easy to grow plants, very effective, especially when you work with carbon limitation and oligotrophic water. They still grow with very few nutrients in the water, and that's quite important for the swimming pool. And this is middle spring, what I told you, where all the blues and the whites are blooming. You see how the colors changes in this area, and the same every 3 to 6 weeks, we have a completely different garden. So after the end, yes, I would say by the end of the spring, no more white, no more blue, but you will have a lot of plants blooming in the purple, dark pink shade of color, which is one of my favorite, which is quite similar to the color of Fuchsia magellanica. There's a lot of native, but also exotic plants. So you'll see like a mixture between guneras, all the arrayanes, which is lumas, and Eugenias, which are native from Chile, but also with some Japanese maple, some echinacеas also, and we build a very dynamic and interesting plant community. We do love with Macarena to have plants near the house. We like the lodge atmosphere, like to have the plants surrounded by, to have the house surrounded by plants. And we like very much this plants dynamic. And this is a pool area, also the swimming pool area. And you can see that there's no white or blue anymore, but you have a lot of this pink, dark pink, and you'll have lighter pink in fall and some purple. And all the plants are sharing and living in the same place, which is called a dynamic multi-layered plant community. End of the summer. And what I've learned and what I can share with you is that the most important thing when you want to do an ecosystemic landscape is by far observation, because there's a lot of information, but not that much information. And usually you don't know which are the plants that you want to use or which are the insects that you want to attract. So for us with Macarena, observation has been the best teacher. So we have to try to understand how plant communities, native or created by man, they interact, how they work, how they grow. And it's very important because it gives you a lot of information. So you have to try to give yourself time to collect it. I love when I have the opportunity to work with specialists like entomologists, soil scientists, microbiologists, specialists in social behavior, because you can really change how the people interact with the garden or with other people. It's very enriching and useful when you can work with other specialists. If you have a space, this is interesting because try to do as much plant research as you can in your garden, but not just to work with plant compatibilities. Try to understand what they attract, how they work together, how they grow, how this way of growing is dynamic or it is not, which is the light tolerance, the shade tolerance, etc. Try to do research about water wise plants. So what we're doing now in Chile is because of this big drought, I'm letting a lot of the plants in my garden die because I know that I have to change them because I cannot continue watering as much as I was watering. And we have to change the way we do gardening because we have to try to have lower maintenance gardens. This is probably one of the things that I've learned in all these years. We have as designer to think low maintenance garden and try to visit as much as you can the gardens that you've designed and built because you got a lot of information. Usually people think that you learn in the university or reading a book, yes, but a lot of the discoveries that we've made with Macarena, they've been because we've been again in the gardens we built. So we know what we did wrong, what we did good, how the plants are interesting, how they grow. So I usually check a lot of my gardens. I've been doing this for 25 years, not all the gardens, but as much as I can to see how they grow, especially when I use new plants, especially when I use exotic plants, because I have to see if they start to become invasive. And my own garden has been very useful to better understand how plants communities and how ecosystemic landscapes work. I've done a lot of research. I'm always building new plants communities by planting, sowing. I see how they change the color, how they work, what they attract. If I use different pruning seasons, it's very important for me, which is a wildlife that is attracted to plants, not just the native ones, but also the exotic ones. Because if I'm going to use exotic plants, I just want to use non-invasive and plants that are useful for the environment, especially when I work in cities. To understand the dynamic of the plant communities, because a plant community is always changing and everything is very dynamic and it depends very much on which is your neighbor. So I can see how everything changed depending on the neighbors. And one of the very important things is not just think about the color, but things about food supply and have photosynthetic activity. Because when you think of food supply, I don't think just in what I see, but I think now very much about root exudates. Because I know if I have always root exudates and a lot of different plants, I know that I will have a very dynamic and diverse microbiology in the soil. And this is a way to store carbon, to build again the soil. And a good soil means plant with no illness. And I love to see how the plants emerge when I build these plant communities to see what happens, because I build it with different plant cycles. So I love this moment when one cycle is ending and you can see that the new cycle is passing through the old one. And not just to think, because we've been working in Chile a lot with water-wise plants, but I think that's not enough. Water-wise, it's easy, there's a lot of information, but what I need is not just to understand which are the plants that will thrive in this drought, but I also need to know which are the plants that are attract the most biodiversity as I can. I love to see how the plants die and to see what happens when the cycles change. And every one of you invited to visit me in Chile whenever you can, and very excited to be here. And thank you very much for the attention. There's a lot more to show you, but I think that's a little bit of what we've done with Macarena and what I've done the last 25 years.
Bravo.
Wow, thank you, Cristóbal.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions for Cristóbal? Actually, I have one. What did you mean by root exudates?
Which is very interesting is that when you think in photosynthetic activity, we think that this work is used just to for new leaves or to produce fruits, etc. But the plants use between the 30 and can be up to the 70% of the energy they collect to produce root exudates, which is, in a very easy way, imagine how can I say, it's like a liquid with that provides energy to the microbiology, because in the soil you have a lot of organisms like fungi, mushrooms, and bacteria that needs energy.
Mm-hmm.
And this microbiology lives very near the root system, provides the roots with a lot of different things, but in exchange, the plants give to them root exudates.
Oh.
So this is very important. That's how nature works. So we stopped using chemical fertilizers because we used to use a lot of fertilizers, but we're not using anymore. And what we do now is we use like substrates with a good drainage, which is absolutely important for our Mediterranean plants. And I usually use some compost tea or some humus exudate, lixiviate, sorry, to inoculate my my community. And I also go to some native areas, well-preserved native areas, to take some soil samples to inoculate my garden with this microbiology. But this microbiology need the plant exudate. You understand, Ellen?
Yes,
But
yes.
it's
I'm not aware of that. I'm gonna have to do a little bit more research, but thank you.
Yeah, there's a symbiotic relationship between each plant, and they all secrete some sort of nutrient to benefit the others.
Interesting. Thank you, guys. Any other questions for
There's one question of Leslie. You mentioned several of the gardens require almost no maintenance. Does it mean there's no cutting back, pruning, or deadheading? Normally, no deadheading, because we don't have time, we don't have people to do that. So what we're doing now is that we're using what is one of the very interesting things of Mediterranean plants. Not all the plants, but a lot of plants do have reshoot. When, for example, when there's a big fire or something like this, the plant is destroyed and you have the regrow again. Like, for example, with the fuchsias. You can cut back the fuchsia, almost destroy the fuchsia, and you'll see that the fuchsia just grow again. So what we're using, especially in public spaces, is because we know that we will not have people that knows how to prune the plants. We're using these communities made with this plant adapted to this kind of very aggressive things, perturbation, I would call that. And what we do is every 1 or 2 years, you cut everything back, except the trees. But you can even cut the bushes, especially when you're working in public areas where you have, like, for example, where security is very important. The instruction that we give to the garden is that you just have to cut everything and leave just like 10 centimeters, except the trees. And they cut everything and everything grows in a matter of weeks. That's what I mean, is almost no maintenance. And using this this stone mulch makes the weedings almost not to appear, because the biggest finally work especially when you start a garden, is weeding. But when you have the mulch, the layer of stone mulch, you almost have no weeds. So what we have now is, for example, and I was visiting now in the south of Chile's garden, which is like 3,000 square meters, which is a big garden, and almost the whole garden was planted with a very small lawn area. And normally in Chile, you need one guy coming twice a week to keep the garden perfect for 3,000 square meters. And so it means 8 times a month. But this garden was maintained just 2 times in the year. So almost no maintenance. And it was amazing. So it's a lot of saving in money, a lot of saving in work. And that means that the owner can work in the garden and feel happy to work with, but not to be a slave of the garden. So we're using this mulch, this stone mulch system almost in every garden that now we're building in Chile. And because it's a very stony country, we have stone everywhere. So it's not a problem to use a stone mulch, but it works fine. So good question, Leslie. We normally use grays, pebbles. I think it's pebble. It's a small stone about half an inch of diameter. I think the English name is pebble, but I'm not sure, or gravel. But it's very much what Bet Chato did in her garden. With the gravel garden, it's very much like this, but the gravel is a little bit bigger. Not nice to walk in, but in the plants area, it's very good because you don't have almost any weed. And normally the stone mulch part is about 10 centimeters. It depends on the area. For example, when you work in very arid areas, you can use 8. But for example, when you work in the south of Chile, where it's very rainy and you have a lot of weed problem, probably I will use 12 or even 15 centimeters of stone.
Okay, there's a couple other questions there.
How do you prepare a new site that has a lot of weeds? That's a good question, because usually we use a small machine that cuts everything. We take everything out, and normally we put a stone. So even you have a big weed seed bank, they will start to grow, but it's very hard for a lot of weeds to grow when you have this stone mulch. Probably you have a bush, for example, that is invasive. It's not going to work for the bush. So finally, maybe I'm going to use an herbicide for this bush. But for all the small weeds, normally the stone is enough. You don't need to do a lot more. I'll show you some picture of this because I think it's interesting to show it. Because you see at the very beginning, it looks awful. So normally when you build this to a customer, you know that the first 6 months, they will hate you. But then 6 months after, normally they will start to love you again. They will invite you to have lunch. But before that, oof, huge problem. Look, this is how it looks at the beginning. So you can have an idea of what we're using. So here you have a plant community. You can see that we use high density. We use trees, shrubs, and everything, and ground covers. We have a lot of different plants. And look how the mulch looks at the beginning. So it's not very attractive, but you can see this is a half an inch stone. Normally, what we call a river stone, which is the cheapest that we have. Very common. We use it a lot for building construction. This is a picture of the same area 6 months after. So normally, you don't see the stone anymore. What is good is that usually when you have the stone, you have a very good drainage, the first like 10 centimeters of the soil. So a lot of these plants love free draining soil. So they usually grow a lot faster when you plant them in just dirt. But what you have to be careful is when you plant in summer, probably the first 2 to 3 weeks, you will have to water the plants with not an irrigation system, but you will have to use a pipe. Can I say that? Manguera. I don't know how to translate that, but like a I hope, yeah.
Manguera
Thank
is
you,
hose.
Casper. Thank you, Michael. So that's what you have to use at the beginning, and then 3 weeks after, normally you have all the roots coming into the dirt, and then you can use a drip irrigation system. But this system is amazing how it works. We're using it for the last 3 years, and we have amazing gardens with very low maintenance, no weeding, and that's amazing.
So do you scrape off the original soil level down the 10 centimeters and then plant and then put the mulch in it, or do you put the
It depends very much. For example, when you have, for example, a very compact soil, because when you build a house, you have all the machines coming and all the works. So usually you have a very compact soil. What I use is I use a machine to decompactar. Decompact, can I say that?
Yep, decompact, yep.
I mean, to decompact the soil, and usually I just put the gravel over I don't make any soil preparation, just decompactation. And normally when you have a soil which has been with no vegetations for a time, we usually inoculate with some compost, but we use almost nothing. We need the microbiology. I don't need the compost. I need the biology of the compost. So usually you have a big plot, you can use compost tea. And usually we use the compost tea, the first year we made, we sprayed it with the compost tea once or twice a year, the first 1 or 2 years. And then normally we just leave the garden and it's okay. But the thing is that you cannot use any pesticide and not use any fertilizer. Just allow the biology to do the work.
And that's compost tea? As in,
yes.
Mix it with water and then water it with that?
Yeah, normally water with no chlorine. So I usually use a small, this small kind of pool that I use for kids when they're very small. So I put some compost. First I put the water. I wait 1 or 2 days for the chlorine to evaporate. I put the compost in a bag. I use a aquarium air pump too, normally, because it's a big thing. And then I take the water and I just water the gardens. And what Bart is saying, absolutely, I agree. I think that the rock mulch is a lot better than the organic mulch, especially for Mediterranean and semi-arid plants. You need the water to be far from the shoots. So I've seen with a lot of my native plants that I was unable to make them grow. When I started using this system, I've seen a huge change in the way they grow. No rooting, no illness. It's incredible how it works. So if you love Mediterranean plants, what I think you do, I use the rock mulching, but I will never use the organic. And at least for us, a big disaster. For a lot of our native plants, especially the ones that are more adapted to drought, the organic mulch, not very good.
And the crown of the plant is on the top of the mulch or underneath the mulch, and then you pile the.
Normally, there's about 3 centimeters of a stone layer of the crown of the plants, because it doesn't hold any water, so it's not a problem. So you just water, and the waters will go and especially when you have when you have big drought like we're having now in Chile, when you work this stone mulch, the waters go to the soil, to the ground very fast, and you keep the soil very with a very nice temperature. So you can see how the plants love the soil. That is not, and normally when you go to our Mediterranean system, we naturally have normally a huge stone mulch, and all the plants are growing in between the stones. They don't grow in the soil. You usually have the soil under the stone. So most of our plants don't like very hot soils. And when you start using the mineral mulch, you can see how they start growing. They change the color. And when you add the microbiology, huge change. I don't like to use the compost because usually when you have, it's retain a lot of water normally. And for a lot of my native plants to have compost near the crown means that they will die, especially for all the solanum, for example, the coastal area, the solanum with compost or the chistantes will die in a week. But with the stone and just with some compost tea, they will grow. I will have amazing plants very fast and with no illness. Amazing. So
Wow.
so the mulch absolutely works.
Wow, terrific. Wonderful. Does anybody else have any other questions for Cristóbal?
Yeah,
think
when
that-
is he gonna write a book?
I don't know, but maybe one day. But this is why it's so interesting, this kind of communities where we share information. The most important is that we have to share as much as we can to make better gardens and to make more ecology in our landscapes.
Well, you're doing a good job of educating all of us, because that's really interesting, all your research and experience. And we're grateful that you're passing this on to us. Thank you.
Cristóbal, are more landscape designers in Chile starting to adopt the practices that you've been sharing with us?
You know that before this year, not many people, because we're still, you know, Chile is a wonderful country, but it's very difficult to make changes. I mean, if you see, for example, the way we used to garden like 20 years ago, and now it's pretty much the same. But we think that probably we will have water restrictions in a month. If we don't get any rain this a normal year, this winter, we're going to have water restrictions. And we've never faced again water restriction because Santiago is a big city, but we have huge mountains and we used to have huge glaciers. So water was not a problem. But after 14 years of severe drought, water is starting to be a huge problem for us. So what I've seen is that we're changing very much the way we're using water, and that makes me happy. So you see that a lot of people are starting to change, to reduce their lawns, and they're planting more water-wise plants. We're not still doing a lot of ecology in the gardens, but I think that every day more and more people are starting to understand that they can really change the diversity of where they live, just changing the plants they use. And that's amazing to see. Yeah, I think it's changing. I would like to see it happen faster, but it's changing.
Mark asked if when you visited California, did you see anybody designing in your methods?
I saw a lot more of that in Arizona. I saw some of that in San Francisco area, and I didn't see very much of that in the like Los Angeles area.
Uh-huh.
So I think that we're quite similar. So I saw a lot of gardens in California, and they're so similar to our gardens. Still a lot of lawn, a lot of very not useful plants. So we're just using plants because they're beautiful. But if you stay just maybe half an hour or 1 hour, you won't see anything visiting the plants. So we're using, I think that we're wasting a lot of water and energy using plants that are not useful. And the thing is that we have to start trying to use plants that we see some biological activity. So we're not using the plant just because we like it, but we're using the plant because we see that a lot of more things happen. And we have to start using more native plants, but at the same time, we have to be free to use some exotic plants, because some non-invasive exotic plants can be very useful when you want to do some conservation. That's one of the things that I've learned. At the very beginning, I just was trying to use native plants. And then I discovered that some exotic can be very, very useful, especially for a lot of our native bees. They're very attractive and they're very popular plants. So what happened with the hummingbird, for example, is that we have the main source of food of our hummingbird is a parasite plant. So people do not plant it, they destroy it. So it's very hard to change the people's mind to start using a plant that is a bad plant for them. But we know that a lot of the sages are the main food source for a lot of for example, Argentinian and Mexican hummingbirds. So our hummingbirds also recognize this plant as a food supply. So because it's going to be hard to change people's mind, I know that if I use, for example, some leucanthus or some indigo spire or whatever, I know that the food supply for hummingbird will be, and I have the time to change people's mind using the native plant that is a food source, at least in my region. That's going to take maybe 20 years, but I have the food. So I always say that to make people understand that some exotic plants can really make a big difference. Just use the plants that are not invasive. You have to be very careful about that.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, we really appreciate your presentation and enjoyed you last time and certainly enjoyed you this time. And it's so enlightening to get a just different perspective on gardening, which you're spreading the word. And there's a lot of professionals that are on the call or on the program. So I'm sure they'll be adapting a lot of those philosophies.
And everyone invited to come to Chile. And I hope you, because I know that the group, when they came, there was a huge drought. So everything was not blooming as it usually blooms, but I hope this year we're going to have a better rain. So it's going to be a lot nicer than the last time you came.
Well, I'm definitely coming back at some point, and hopefully sooner than later.
Great.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful talk.
No, thank you, Bart.
Thank you very much.
Could I ask one question? Was there
Yes,
anything
Grace,
special?
of
Thank you.
course.
Was there anything special in how you made your compost tea?
I mean, it's very simple. I just usually take what I told you. I just take one baby pool. I usually put water. I wait 2 days, maybe 3, for the chlorine to evaporate.
Mm-hmm.
Normally, the most important of the compost tea is the compost. So I use Grace, a compost with no bad smell. You have to smell the compost and like the scent of the compost. A lot of the time you take a compost which is very stinky, has very bad smell, and this compost was you have too much nitrogen on it. And usually in terms of diversity, the diversity is very small. So when you have a compost that has soil scent, when the forest soil is humid, this scent, this is a compost I will use. I usually take a bag, a big one, and I put with a bag with a lot of holes, obviously. I put the compost inside, just like a tea, I do this, and I leave the compost, and I use an aquarium air pump, which are two, with a diffuser to move the water in a shady place. And then normally I leave this for 24 to 48 hours, and then I take the compost tea and I just use it in the garden, which is very good also. Is you made, I don't know how to say that, but vermicompost with lombrices are, it's not compost, it's humus. And usually when you use, how do you call in English, the red animal, very long, like a small snake?
Oh,
Yeah, earthworms.
Earthworm.
Earthworm.
Worm castings. Worm castings.
So you use worm casting, and you take the liquid that usually you produce, and I also use this one, which normally is very rich in bacteria. And when you have trees, it's very interesting to use leaf compost, make from leaves. Usually the leaf compost take a lot longer to be created because it has a lot of carbon, but usually this compost has a lot of different mushrooms because the bacteria cannot eat the leaves because it has a lot of carbon. I mean, the ratio between carbon and nitrogen is more to the carbon. So I usually, when you want to have good trees, I usually use leaf mold. Yes, thanks, Grace.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
okay. Well, thank you so much, Cristóbal. Again, we really appreciate it and enjoyed the talk so much.